It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Margaret Hofer, Senior Vice President and Museum Director since 2015 of the New York Historical Society. Ms. Hofer, known as Margie, will be speaking to us about the Dutch silver in the New York Historical Society's collections, and she comes to this subject from a base of deep knowledge. Among the many exhibitions she has curated and the books and exhibition catalogs she has written, one stands out in particular: Stories in Sterling, 4 Centuries of Silver in New York. For this stunning exhibit, she was awarded a prize for Outstanding Museum Catalogs by the Association of Art Museum Curators. We are in good hands today. Please welcome Margaret Hofer.
Thank you very much, Kurt. How do I advance the slides? Do I just let you know? Okay. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to be here and to speak at your annual meeting. I'm very honored. The Society of Daughters of Holland Dames and the New York Historical Society have strong ties that go back more than a century. Can I have the first slide? In 1908, the Dames donated the magnificent stained glass window in our library depicting the arrival of Henry Hudson and funded the window's restoration in 2011. Your organization has also entrusted its records to our research library, and there's overlap and synergy in our missions to collect and preserve New York's early history, make it accessible to the general public, and to foster research. Today I'm going to speak about silver in Dutch New York, both Dutch-made silver brought here by colonists and silver made in New York by silversmiths of Dutch descent. I'm going to focus particularly on silver made for Dutch families. Many of the names will, of course, be quite familiar to this group, and I expect that I'll be speaking about actual family members of some of you. You've learned that I wrote a book on the New York Historical Society's silver collection in 2011. As part of that research, I did a lot of deep genealogical digging, and that's a challenge that I really relish. Let's just say that I get my money's worth out of my annual Ancestry.com subscription. Almost all of the objects that I'll be showing you are from the New York Historical Society's collection, and all but 1 or 2 were donated by descendants of the original owners, whose names you'll see in the captions. Although New Netherland came under English rule in 1664, Dutch values and traditions remained strong in New York City and the Hudson Valley well into the 18th century and even into the 19th. The persistence of Dutch culture was reflected in language, social customs, architecture, furniture, and a wide variety of objects, especially silver. New York silver objects reflect the high value placed on preserving Dutch identity in an increasingly heterogeneous society. Next slide, please. One of the key ways Dutch colonists carried on their cultural traditions was by bringing Dutch-made objects, including silver, with them to New Netherland. Silver objects served multiple purposes. In the days before regular currency and established banks, they were a means of storing wealth. Objects could be melted down and exchanged for the intrinsic value of silver or for new items in the latest fashion. Silver objects were also a way of perpetuating traditions, especially rituals around drinking, dining, marking rites of passage, or religious practices. And finally, as we'll see, silver heirlooms perpetuated family ties. They were tangible links to the past that reminded succeeding generations about their ancestors and their Dutch roots. I like to think of silver objects as bearers of memory and tradition. Family heirlooms brought to America by settlers played an important role in preserving Dutch culture in the distant colony. This well-worn beaker, made in 1589, came to America in the 1650s. It is the earliest object in the New York Historical Society's silver collection, and perhaps the oldest Dutch silver heirloom in the United States. The beaker served to memorialize a Van Rensselaer family hero, Captain Hendrik Van Rensselaer, who died in 1602 at the Siege of Ostend, a bloody 3-year battle between the Dutch and the Spanish for control of the United Provinces. Hendrik was father of the first patroon of Rensselaerswyck, Kilian Van Rensselaer. The engraving on the underside suggests that it was used during convivial gatherings of men. It translates loosely, "When one sings songs, beware and take care, better spare your wisdom for other times." Next slide. This seal matrix belonged to Kilian Van Rensselaer, the first patroon and founder of the colony of Rensselaerswyck. Matrices were used to impress wax seals and were important in assuring the authenticity of documents. This seal facilitated communication between Van Rensselaer, an Amsterdam diamond merchant, and his agents in New Netherland. As Van Rensselaer never set foot in New Netherland, his written communications were essential. Beginning in 1630, he began amassing an estate that would total more than 700,000 acres and extending 48 miles on each side of the Hudson. The seal identifies the owner around the periphery and bears the family coat of arms at the center. And note the crest with the iron basket with flames. We'll see that again later. Van Rensselaer would have worn it suspended from a chain on his belt. Like the beaker, it came to America with his son Jeremias in 1654, his successor as patroon. The seal descended in an unbroken patrilineal line for more than 200 years to the donor. Next slide. And one more Van Rensselaer heirloom, this one held by the Museum of the City of New York. These standing salts were made by Amsterdam silversmith Loef Fredericks in 1623. They were presented to Kilian Van Rensselaer, grandson of the first patroon, in 1683 as a christening gift from his grandmother and godmother, Anna van Welle Van Rensselaer. The salts were already an heirloom by that time. They were probably made originally for Anna's mother, Leonora, based on the initials that are engraved underneath. They may seem odd for a baby's gift, but they suggest the family's aspirations for the infant. Great salts were a Northern European tradition of the late medieval era. They marked the place of honor at the table and were the most significant piece of table silver at the time. These forms gave rise to the expression to be above or below the salt. Their hexagonal bodies are engraved with representations of the months of the year. The lucky infant went on to become a silversmith and the third patroon, as we'll learn about in a bit. Next slide. Here is one more example of a very early Dutch-made heirloom, perhaps the only one we can place with certainty in New Amsterdam during the period of Dutch rule. Peter Stuyvesant brought this newly minted Dutch seal matrix with him when he arrived in May 1647 to assume his duties as Director General of New Netherland. It was probably made not long after May 1645, when Stuyvesant was selected by the Dutch West India Company to succeed Director William Kieft. Its Latin inscription mentions Novi Belgi and Curaçao, references to Stuyvesant's governance over both New Netherland and the Caribbean island. The seal betrays signs of heavy use. It descended in the male line and was donated with the portrait in 1909. Next slide. Until the 1670s or 80s, all silver in the colony was made elsewhere. The earliest surviving silver actually made in New York dates from the last quarter of the 17th century. These pieces were created almost exclusively by Dutch immigrants or silversmiths of Dutch descent. New York's silversmithing community remained predominantly Dutch in character through about 1720. Even as late as 1750, more than half of New York silversmiths had Dutch heritage. While imported silver had a strong influence on local manufacture, the transmission of family traditions also had an impact. I'd like to discuss several New York silver forms and stylistic details that are particularly Dutch in character. Let's go to the next slide. Silver beakers were used in Dutch homes for drinking beer, and after the Protestant Reformation, they were also used in churches for Holy Communion. Imported Dutch beakers, like the Van Rensselaer ones we saw earlier, were an important means of transferring style to the New World. New York silversmiths replicated the form and decoration of Dutch models. The tall cylindrical shape, the flared rim, and the engraved strapwork and foliate scrolls. This pair is owned by Old First, the first Reformed Dutch church of Brooklyn, established in 1654. They were gifted to the church in 1684 by a wealthy parishioner, Maria Body, mother-in-law of the silversmith. The beakers were made by New York City silversmith Jurien Blanc, who was the son and namesake of a silversmith who had trained in Amsterdam. The Old First beakers are engraved with images of faith, hope, and charity. They are now on loan to the New York Historical Society. They've been on display for more than 10 years, I think. But they are occasionally recalled by the church to use in events that celebrate its Dutch roots. Next slide. No silver form better embodies the perpetuation of Dutch tradition and fashion in New York than the Brandywine Bowl. It's a decorative vessel favored by elite families of Dutch descent. Brandywine bowls are traditionally associated with the Dutch ritual of the Kindermaal, a celebratory feast held in honor of a mother and her newborn child. The guests, predominantly female, feasted on sweet cakes and communally sipped a potent brew of brandy and raisins from a bowl such as this. The bowl is engraved with several sets of initials, which trace its ownership through 6 generations of the De Peyster family. The earliest set indicates that the bowl was made for New York City merchant Cornelius De Peyster and his wife Maria Banker, who married in 1694. The lobed, 2-handled bowls clearly derive from Dutch models. In America, the more elaborate examples like this are engraved with flowers, especially tulips. Next slide. This example, held by the Met, was made by a different New York maker, Cornelius Kierstead, but you'll see that the form and decoration are nearly identical to the Society's bowl. This one was made for the prosperous Dutch-American baker, Tunis Jacobson Quick, and his wife, Fradje. It's decorated with exuberant repoussé-chased flowers on the 6 panels, a different variety on each. Next slide. So what did you use to scoop the raisins out of your Brandywine bowl? You used a spoon like this. Spoons of this type with their broad oval bowls and cast handles were based on Dutch prototypes and were produced by New York silversmiths of Dutch descent from the 1680s until around 1700. About a dozen of them survive. but this is the only example embellished with a visual pun referring to its owner. The spoon was made for Johannes Schenk and his wife, Maria Magdalena de Hees, who married in the Netherlands in 1683 and shortly thereafter emigrated to New Amsterdam. The couple then settled in Flatbush, Brooklyn in 1691. Engraved on the reverse of the spoon bowl is Schenk's personal mark, a shapely coffee pot with steam issuing enticingly from its spout. The mark is a creative reference to Schenk's surname, which means to pour or decant. The use of rebuses, or visual puns, in coats of arms was not uncommon in American silver. A few other examples are the Clock family with K, which means bell, that used an image of a bell, the Roosevelt family, a rose bush, and the Wynkoop family, a man proffering a glass. Wynkoop means one who sells wine. And next slide. Tankards are a quintessential American silver form, generally associated with convivial gatherings of men, but also presented to couples at the time of their wedding. Early New York silversmiths grafted Dutch ornament onto what was primarily an Anglo form, creating a regionally distinct version. This tankard betrays Dutch influence in its overall shape, a broad, squat shape, and also its decoration. It's got a flat top, unlike the domed tops that you find in Boston, a crenellated flange, a cocoon thumb piece, and it features decorative details that were probably first introduced by Dutch and Huguenot makers. The baseband is embellished with meander wire and cup cardwork, and I'm going to point to them so you can see. So this wavy wire is meander wire, and then this is the cup card decoration. Looks like a series of leaves going around the base. And also on the handle, there are cast elements that are very New York. The lion passant, which symbolizes fortitude, and on the handle terminal, there's a cherub's head, symbolizing love and fidelity. The engraved initials, which are on the handle, AP, presumably refer to the tankard's original owner, Abraham de Peyster. We know from his estate inventory that de Peyster owned 7 tankards. It's possible he had a matching set, and they all looked like this. He was one of the city's wealthiest and most prominent citizens and served as its mayor from 1691 to 1693. And on the right, you see a 19th century engraving of his Queen Street home built in 1695 and demolished in 1856. Next slide. New York's wealthy colonial Dutch residents frequently gave gifts of silver to one another to mark special occasions. They were particularly fond of making presentations at threshold events such as births, christenings, weddings, and funerals. While these objects served utilitarian purposes and were used for display, I would argue that their symbolic value is perhaps more important to the individuals who presented and received them. These objects serve to strengthen familial bonds and preserve memories of loved ones. Next slide. Let's start with weddings. This simple ring from 1627 is virtually indistinguishable from the wedding bands used today to symbolize the marital bond between 2 people. The gold medal evokes purity, and the circular shape symbolizes never-ending love. The ring's outer surface is decorated with a wreath or marriage chaplet. It's quite worn, so difficult to see now. And on the inside of the band is a Dutch inscription. Note that I'm including a few gold items in the talk about silver. That's because in this country, gold and silver were made by the same craftspeople. And gold so exceedingly rare that there are only a handful of examples that survive from the 17th and 18th centuries. The engraved inscription reveals that the ring was presented by Kilian van Rensselaer, the first patroon and owner of the seal that we saw, to his second wife, Anna van Relle, on their wedding day, December 14th, 1627. According to family history, the ring was brought to New Netherland in 1675 by Kilian's youngest son, the Reverend Nicholas van Rensselaer, who may have reused it when he married Alida Schuyler later that year. It passed from the eldest male child in each succeeding generation. 8 generations after the original marriage ceremony, Kilian van Rensselaer V, who was the donor, used the ring as a pledge of commitment when he married Dorothy Manson in St. Bartholomew's Church, just a few blocks north of here, in 1905. Next slide. This small, delicate tray was made to hold the straight pins that were essential to fastening a woman's dress in the 17th century. Trays like this were found in large, elaborate toilet sets used by aristocratic women beginning in the 17th century. The engraved initials CDP link it to Dutch-born Catharina de Peyster, and the raised hearts suggest that it may have been a wedding gift for her 1683 marriage to her cousin Abraham de Peyster. They married near Amsterdam. And this is the Abraham whose Tankard and Queen Street home we saw a few moments ago. Catharina came to New York the following year and brought this personal item with her. Compared to her husband's beefy tankard, Catharina's pin tray is a decidedly feminine object and being linked to her toilette, much more personal. The miniature portrait that you see on the right is Catharina's great-great-great-granddaughter, Catherine de Peyster, who bequeathed the pin tray, along with many other family heirlooms, to the New York Historical Society in 1911. I imagine she was particularly fond of the tray since it bore her own initials. Next slide. Silver tankards held great meaning for colonial Americans, and many can be connected to weddings. This example was described by the donor as a wedding tankard, and it was presented to Cornelia de Peyster and Oliver Stephen Teller, who married in New York City in 1712. The couple's initials are prominently engraved on the handle, and this is the standard format with the surname on top, the man's first name lower left, and the woman's name on the right. So Teller, Oliver, and Catherine. Also, the ornament on the bottom of the handle terminal is a cherub, clasped hands, and ram's skull motif, which refers to marriage and fertility. The maker, Benjamin Wynkoop, used a distinctive heart-shaped mark that you see on the right. Wynkoop's interpretation of the tankard form is very similar to Cornelius Kierstead's. Next slide. The tankard descended in the family with other relics of the couple's marriage: a gold and diamond floriform cluster ring, and the wedding dress and slippers worn by Cornelia in 1712. 2 centuries later, in 1908, Alice Crary wore her great-great-great-grandmother's dress, restyled with those ruffles, at her marriage to Arthur Sutcliffe in the historic Teller House in Dutchess County. Next slide. Continuing with silver linked to weddings, both the maker and the owners of this charming teapot belong to elite Dutch families. The vessel is possibly the oldest extant teapot made in New York It bears the coat of arms of the Schuyler family on one side, and that's the side on the right, and a cipher with the initials of Johannes Schuyler and his wife Elizabeth on the left. The marriage chaplet above the cipher and the surrounding feathery wreath tied with a bow indicate that the teapot commemorates the couple's marriage in 1695. Tea drinking was a relatively new phenomenon. It had been introduced to England only in the 1650s. This pot reflects early experimentation of the form. The silversmith was Kilian van Rensselaer, the grandson of the first patroon and the recipient of those salts we saw. His widowed mother, Marie van Cortlandt van Rensselaer, arranged his training. Because of war in Holland, she apprenticed 15-year-old Kilian to a New York City silversmith in 1678, and then sent him to Boston to complete his training with Jeremiah Dummer. Kilian set up shop outside of Albany in 1683. He eventually gave up silversmithing to manage Rensselaer's. Next slide. Here are the teapot's owners. Captain Johannes Schuyler was the sixth and youngest son of Philip Peter Schuyler, founder of the Schuyler family in America. He married Elizabeth Stotts Wendell in 1695. Unusually, she was a decade older than her new husband, and she was also a widow with 11 children.
And a large fortune. Sorry.
Oh, that's important. Captain Schuyler was a wealthy fur trader and mayor of Albany, but maybe not as wealthy as his new bride. Next slide. We have two other pieces of silver made for Johannes and Elizabeth Schuyler. This salver is unmarked, but was possibly made by Kilian van Rensselaer. Interestingly, it melds some Boston and New York features. By the late 17th century, salvers such as this had become a trendy English form. This example has some distinctive New York details, like the punch floral motif encircling the foot, just above the foot. Its gudruni, which is the series of convex flutes, is similar to Boston examples. The face of the salver is prominently engraved with the Schuyler coat of arms, surrounded by luxurious Baroque mantling, and the underside bears the engraved initials of the Schuylers. Next slide. The third piece of silver made for the Schuylers is this mug used for drinking beer or ale. This is one of a pair made for the couple by Albany silversmith Conrad Tenike. The couple's intertwined initials are engraved on the face in the same configuration as on the teapot. The mug's heavy moldings, meander wire, and boldly scrolled handle identify it as a New York-made object. The mug's identical mate is held by the Met. Ours was a gift of Elizabeth Harrison and her brother in 1941. Theirs was donated by another female descendant, Annie Clarkson, in 1927. Next slide. Small, shallow, two-handled bowls such as this were fairly common in New England and New York from the second half of the 17th century through about 1730. Usually referred to as dram cups or two-eared cups, the vessels were intended to hold a small serving of liquor. In New York, they were owned almost exclusively by families of Dutch descent and likely had symbolic value. This example is inscribed Janische Rapalje, probably for Janische Rapalje, the daughter of a Newtown Queens brewer. The engraving of her full name on the bowl's underside and the use of her name's Dutch form suggests that it might have been presented for a special occasion, possibly upon her marriage to Jan de Beauvois of Newtown in 1729. Next slide. Another wedding gift is this diminutive tankard Emblazoned with the arms of the Crook family, it belonged to Katerina Elmendorf-Leger. Katerina was born in Kingston, New York, to Petrus Elmendorf and Mary Crook. The family typified the intermingling of Dutch and English culture that characterized mid-18th century New York and Kingston in particular. Perhaps because of Kingston's deep-rooted Dutch culture, the Crook family worked hard to preserve their English identity. The London-made tankard, probably a belated wedding gift to Catherine from her mother, proudly asserts the English origins of her mother's family. The tankard sustained a matriarchal legacy. It passed from mother to daughter in all but one of the succeeding generations. The Crook tankard's physical form mirrors its female-dominated history. It is petite, not broad and hefty like typical New York tankards. Its high-domed lid evokes rounded contours of the female body, and its delicate handle terminal with a heart, symbol of love and devotion, suggests a feminine association. Next slide. Katerina enjoyed a life of wealth. The family's prosperity is manifest in this charming portrait of her at age 5, posed with a decorative vase spilling over with an abundance of exotic flowers. I wish this was at the New York Historical Society, but it's at the Met. Next slide. The final wedding item is this gold buckle belonging to Sarah Bayard, daughter of Dutch-born merchant Petrus Bayard and his wife Blandina Kierstead. When Blandina died in 1702, she left Sarah, her dear and well-beloved daughter, fine clothing, a bed, and, quote, 12 pounds in money to make her a silver tankard when she is of age or married. Sarah may have purchased this gold item instead, or it may have been presented to her around the time of her marriage to Abraham van Gaspach Chambers in 1703. She would have used the buckle to secure a girdle with a narrow ribbon belt worn around her waist. Silversmith Everardus Bogardus was a grandson and namesake of the legendary Dutch Reformed minister. His work is rare, and this is the only work in gold known to survive. Next slide. Moving on to silver presented for births or christenings. To be born with a silver spoon in your mouth is to inherit a life of wealth and privilege. The saint's origin was literal. In a long-standing European tradition, godparents gave children a silver spoon at their christening ceremony. The fortunate child to receive this spoon was Cornelia Dykink, the eldest daughter of Gerrit Dykink and Maria Abiel. She received the spoon from her godfather and uncle, Johannes Abiel, on August 25, 1686. Abiel had it inscribed in Dutch to mark the occasion. Next slide. Cornelia's father was a portrait painter. His self-portrait is on the left, and he painted the portrait of his wife, Maria, on the right, Maria Abiel. Next slide. The spoon's maker, Jesse Kipp, is known through only a dozen or so objects that show his adherence to traditional Dutch forms and decorative techniques. The Kipp spoon is the earliest piece of New York silver in the Historical Society's collection. Jesse Kipp's father, Jacob, emigrated from Amsterdam as a child. He became a major landowner, and in fact, Kipp's Bay is named for him. Jacob built a large yellow brick country estate in 1655 near today's 2nd Avenue and 35th Street. When it was demolished in 1851, it was said to be the oldest house in New York City at the time. Next slide. According to the engraved inscription on this Amsterdam-made tea kettle, it was presented to Daniel Crommelin Verplanck upon his christening in 1762, another rather strange gift for a baby. It was presented by his grandfather and godfather, Daniel Crommelin. The younger Daniel was born in New York City to Samuel Verplanck and Judith Crommelin. Samuel had gone to Amsterdam in 1758 to apprentice in the banking business with his uncle, Daniel Crommelin. He ended up marrying his uncle's daughter, Judith, 3 years later. The couple returned to New York City in 1762 and settled into an elegant brick home on Lower Wall Street. At lower right is the Verplanck family cradle in our collection, which would have rocked Daniel as an infant. And above it is the Met's portrait of 9-year-old Daniel with a squirrel, painted by John Singleton Copley in 1771. Slide. Now from the cradle to the grave. In response to the death of loved ones, Dutch New Yorkers coupled private mourning with ritual and public ceremony. Prominent figures were often laid to rest with lavish gatherings. Silver spoons such as this were typical mementos of the deceased given to funeral participants. The custom of presenting silver spoons to mourners was particularly entrenched in the Albany area. Many spoons from Albany families survive, bearing inscriptions identifying the deceased and their date of death. This well-used spoon commemorates the 1788 death of 4-year-old Joanna Westerlo, the daughter of Catherine Livingston Van Rensselaer and Ilardus Westerlo, minister of the Albany Dutch Reformed Church. The handle is engraved, Joanna Westerlo died 4 February 1788, aged 4 years and 11 months. Even though the spoon perpetuated a Dutch tradition, there's nothing particularly Dutch about its form or decoration, and the inscription is in English. By the late 18th century, local silversmiths had fully embraced an Anglo-American style. Next slide. In addition to memorial spoons, New Yorkers of Dutch descent also used gold mourning rings to commemorate deaths. Even into the 19th century, gold and black enamel rings were given to funeral guests as tokens of the deceased, particularly to pallbearers, relatives, and clergymen. This mourning ring commemorates the death of Jacobus Bogert, a prominent New York City baker, in 1811. The black enamel band reads Jacobus Bogert, OB 22, October 1811, age 77. Next slide. The process of Anglicization, as some people call it, in New York City was mostly complete by around 1720. Ethnic heritage no longer exerted a strong influence on the lives of most residents. Even though some families of Dutch descent held on to time-honored traditions, English material culture became standard among the wealthy and middle classes. I'd like to show several examples of New York silver that reflect the emergence of the Anglo-Continental style, which supplanted the Dutch provincial aesthetic by the 1720s. Next slide. This beautifully proportioned coffee pot is a good example of the increasing dominance of English culture in early 18th century New York. Its tall, tapered body, high-domed lid, and the handle oriented at right angles to the spout are modeled directly after London prototypes. Silversmith Peter Van Dyck, born in New York City to Dutch immigrant parents, served patrons of Dutch origin, including Bayard, Phillips, Rutgers, Schuyler, Wendell, Van Rensselaer, and Van Cortlandt families. But they increasingly ordered silver modeled after fashionable English prototypes. Sometimes these forms betray a lingering Dutch influence in certain ornamental details. In this case, the meander wire underneath the upper band of molding there. The coffee pot may have been made originally for Frederick Phillips, proprietor of vast estates in Westchester County. It was owned by his eldest daughter, Susanna Phillips, who married Beverly Robinson. Staunch loyalists, the couple fled to England in 1779 after the New York legislature confiscated their land holdings, bringing the coffee pot with them. Note the pot's donors. Anna Glenn Vitor was, I believe, a former Directress General of the Hall of Dames. Next slide.
For two doors.
Oh, wonderful,
Two, one runs the shop.
terrific.
In the Dutch tradition.
This waiter or small tray was made by the New York City immigrant silversmith Otto Philip Daniel de Parisienne, who was born in Berlin and settled in New York City in 1758. Despite Parisienne's European training, his silver gives no hint of his continental origins. Like much of his surviving work, this small tray with scalloped border and cast moldings of shells and scrolls is purely English in style and draws heavily on London forms. The tray was probably made for Annika Provost around the time of her marriage to Dirk Lefferts in 1761. Their initials are engraved on the underside. The marriage united two prominent New York families of Dutch descent. The later engraving that we see on the tray's face includes the initials of their granddaughter, Anna Beekman, surmounted by the Beekman family crest. Next slide. This shapely tankard was made by New York City silversmith Samuel Tingley around 1765, probably for Stephen Van Rensselaer too. It is adorned with a very English-looking Rococo cartouche framed by asymmetrical scrolls and foliage. Originally, the cartouche probably enclosed the Van Rensselaer coat of arms, but in the 1780s, it was updated with the neoclassical style initials of Philip's son, Stephen's son, Philip Schuyler Van Rensselaer, a prominent Albany banker and two-term mayor of that city. As on other Van Rensselaer family silver, the cartouche is surmounted by the family's crest, an iron basket issuing flames, the same as on that seal from the 1620s. Notice that the tankard does not bear any of the distinctive Dutch-influenced features of early New York tankards. Its shape and ornament are purely Anglo-American. Next slide. To wrap up, I'd like to share one final piece of silver that has a particularly relevant story associated with it. Next slide. This unadorned punch bowl was made by the Amsterdam-trained New York silversmith Taubert Besley for Henry Rutgers and his wife, Catherine de Peyster, who may have received it as a wedding gift in 1732. Their initials are engraved on the underside. The bowl descended for 5 generations in a direct line, primarily through daughters. It held a certain mystique among its later owners. The bowl's 6th owner, Mary de Peyster Rutgers McCrae Conjure Vanity, how's that for a name? Contrived an entire narrative around it in her 1938 book, New York's Making, Seen Through the Eyes of My Ancestors. She describes the gathering at the Rutgers Mansion on the East River in 1755, at which visitors admired Catherine's household appointments, including this elegant bowl, now I'm quoting, of hand-beaten silver, not intricately wrought, but even more lovely than the older pieces. But already Catherine's relatives, their eyes trained since long ago Ghent by possession of objects of beauty, cast covetous eyes on this bowl. The greatest New York silversmith had given it the faintest alloying of copper so that its shadows were translucently, shimmeringly blue. Devoid of tracing, engraving, or embossing, metal appeared to be no part of its making. Rather did it seem a cup-shaped flower born of congealing raindrops of half-lit sky. 20 years before it had been bestowed upon this pair, by a donor not the less convinced of its exquisiteness because its working was not traditional. Mary Vanamy's book held particular interest for another Heister descendant, Waldron Phoenix Belknap Jr., a distant cousin and avid collector of family portraits and silver heirlooms. Vanamy, who settled in England, decided to give the bowl to Belknap during World War II to bring back to the US for safekeeping. Vanamy was relieved to have Belknap spirit the bowl out of war-ravaged Britain and comforted to know that the bowl remained in the family. She approved of its final home at the New York Historical Society, writing in 1950 that it was the heirloom's rightful destination. The story of this simple bowl is eloquent testimony to the role of silver objects as bearers of memory and of familial pride. It also underscores the power of silver to provide a tangible link to ancestors, historical events, and places, to bring the past to life, and to fire our imaginations about our shared past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was wonderful. That really was. And
Do you want me to answer any questions?
anybody have, yeah, sure. Do we have time for some questions? Are there any questions? And we can, if not,
Address them over to
yeah, Margie will be, oh, here's a
Well, I
question.
have a question about the handles, because most of these silver, what were the handles made of on the teapots?
They were generally made of wood, but they would have ivory insulators so that the heat didn't travel through. But we saw one teapot, but I think everything else we saw held cold beverages or room temperature beverages. And a teacup.
So, on behalf of the Society of the Daughters of Holidays, thank you very much for this presentation. We'd like to give you our beautiful scarf.
Thank you.
And also our book of historical records. Wonderful. Thank you very much.